Picture the scene. A young woman is sitting at her desk, writing furiously. The words flow from her mind as she scrawls into the early hours by candlelight, her room awash with papers. She feels a searing ache in her hand, her brow is pinched, her heart is pounding. And then, finally, just as the full moon creeps into view, she pauses and pens the very last sentence of her novel. She puts down her quill, sits back, and stares out into the night. The young woman in question is, if you hadn't guessed by the title of this video, Mary Shelley, and the novel she's finally finished is her Frankenstein. Now, I must confess that my description there was a complete fabrication, but what I do know for sure is that in March 1817, Mary Shelley, or perhaps I should say Mary Godwin, because at this point she hadn't actually yet married the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, did, in some capacity or other, finish her first draft of Frankenstein. And it's no exaggeration to say that the landscape of literature would never be the same again. It wasn't an overnight success, but in only a few short years, this book would take the world by storm. And that storm has been rolling and rumbling ever since. It's one of a handful of texts that has, since its first publication in 1818, never been out of print. Our love for Frankenstein grows and grows, generation after generation, and it's showing no sign of stopping. We've got Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein adaptation coming out in a matter of months. Now, it's no secret why this masterpiece entrances us so. It's scary, it's dark, it's romantic with a capital R, it's an astutely posited ethical clusterfuck, a psychological masterclass, and a relatable deep dive into the big questions that affect us all rolled into one. So, we know why. But what I'm interested in exploring today is how. How did Frankenstein come to be? What were the conditions that led to this 18-year-old coming up with the most recognisable and enduring storybook monster of the last 200 years? What's the story behind the story? Now, we are by no means the first to ask these questions. As Shelley herself put it in the preface to the 1831 edition of the novel, I shall thus give a general answer to the question so frequently asked me, how I, then a young girl, came to think of and to dilate upon so very hideous an idea. How indeed, Mary, how indeed. Now, there's a simple answer to that question. Frankenstein came to Mary in a dream. She even says so herself. After being visited in the night by a vision of the creature that would come to redefine the monster in literature, Shelley wrote that the next day, I announced that I had thought of a story. I began that day with the words, "It was on a dreary night of November," making only a transcript of the grim terrors of my waking dream. But in my experience, a simple answer will eventually betray a more complicated truth. Mary was definitely writing down the horrors of her dream, but is that really the whole story? Did Frankenstein really just spontaneously pop into Mary's mind, seemingly out of nowhere? The way she phrases it here makes it sound like she was beholden to her dream, like she was just documenting what she saw. But in actual fact, many different elements had to coalesce in order for Frankenstein to be born into this world, from the unique specifics of Shelley's upbringing, to her undoubtable talent as a writer, to her own personal tragedies. In this video, I'll be turning back the clock to a time when Frankenstein was yet to be realised. To a time when passion, exploration, heartache and grief were the constant companions of young Mary Godwin. To a time when she and her friends, forced to weather out a dark storm in what would come to be known as the Year Without a Summer, took part in a ghost story writing competition that would change the face of literature forever. Yes, Frankenstein may have come to Mary in a dream, but the drama, the turmoil and fascination that had to occur in order for Mary's subconscious to form such a ghastly creation were all very real. But before we get into all that, welcome. I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcombe, this is Mousy the Mysterious, and we make deep dive analysis videos on books, and cats, so please subscribe if that's your jam. We're very thankful to our patrons over on Patreon who help us to make our videos, and if you'd like to join them, there's a link down below. Just a little announcement in case you're not aware, if you enjoy our Tales by Candlelight videos, the one where I sit in an armchair and read a story or poem by candlelight which I then go on to analyse in a separate long format video, we're now posting those on our new, dedicated Tales by Candlelight channel. The big videos, the analyses will still be here, but the tales are migrating, so please subscribe to our new channel if you want to be alerted when those videos come out. Finally, please be aware this video contains descriptions of child loss, suicide, murder, execution, and body horror. Now, without further ado, take my hand and join me as we step all the way back in time to the very early 1800s to meet dear Mary and, hopefully, find an answer to our question. What is the story behind literature's greatest monster? Now, I have to begin by saying that really we should be referring to this guy as Frankenstein's creature, not his monster, for a whole host of ethical reasons that the novel itself lays out. Calling him a monster is a bit harsh, and you can learn more about that, Frankenstein, and what that novel can teach us about prejudice by clicking here. But for the sake of that tagline, it had to be monster, right? What is the story behind literature's greatest creature is a very different question. It's not quite as spiffy, and obviously literature's greatest creature is the very hungry caterpillar. In many ways, Mary Shelley led a very unconventional life. She was born to radical, dissenting parents and was raised by her father, who introduced her to a lot of the big thinkers and artists of her day while she was still a child. She was encouraged to read widely and received an education not typically available to young people in the early 1800s. Now, I want to jump straight in here and say that Shelley's education, her intellectual ability, and her imagination and experience as a writer need to be recognised as crucial to the formation of Frankenstein. This might sound obvious, but as you'll see, it's almost too easy to credit the origin of the novel to external factors, such as the men in her life who inspired her and helped her with her writing, her personal tragedies, luck, and circumstance. And it's not that these things didn't play a part. I think they did, and I'll go on to explain why I think that. But if we focus too much on who she was surrounded by, the drama of her early years, or the traumas she faced, we risk overlooking her skill and formidable talent as a writer. Writing was, after all, in her blood. It is not singular that, as the daughter of two persons of distinguished literary celebrity, I should, very early in life, have thought of writing. As a child, I scribbled. And my favourite pastime during the hours given me for recreation was to write stories. Still, I had a dearer pleasure than this, which was the formation of castles in the air, the indulging in waking dreams, the following up trains of thought which had for their subject the formation of a succession of imaginary incidents. Shelley credits her famous parents, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote important books like this and this, with inspiring her love of writing. But what we see in this passage is how she very much makes the act of writing her own. She's not simply writing in the shadow of her parents or later her husband. We get a sense here of her experience, her lifelong passion, her love for her craft, and her boundless imaginative capabilities. She was, first and foremost, her own writer. So, as I was saying, Mary Shelley led an unconventional life in terms of the education she received, the people she met, the radical dissenting attitudes of her father and many of his associates, the radical proto-feminist insights of her mother put down in print, and the encouragement to write that she received from a very young age. Her early life was unconventional because of all these things, but also because, in summer 1814, she fell madly in love with the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley and the two of them eloped, when she was only 16 and he was married to another woman. Their passion had far-reaching consequences, including their estrangement from William Godwin, Mary's father, who was pretty free-thinking but not that free-thinking, and the suicide of Percy Shelley's wife, Harriet Westbrook. Running away from home at such a young age with a radical, a married radical no less, was nothing short of scandalous. But Mary did it nonetheless. Now, it didn't go especially well. After travelling and struggling across the continent for a couple of months, Mary, Percy, and Mary's half-sister Claire, who decided to third wheel with them, gave up and returned to London. Mary was not, however, welcomed back with open arms, and she, Percy, and Claire kept house together in fairly dire financial straits. However, in the summer of 1816, they decided to give travelling another whirl, and this time they had somewhere to go. They had been invited here, to the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva, the summer house of poet cum notorious bastard Lord Byron. I say summer house, but it might be more apt to say year without a summer house, because 1816, the year in which we are journeying through the sublime wilderness with Mary, Percy and Claire, was known as the year without a summer, due to the immense eruption in 1815 of Indonesia's Mount Tambora, which formed a dense ash cloud that circled the globe and which caused a worldwide volcanic winter. And not only was the weather uncharacteristically cold, gloomy and dark, but as Mary disembarked the coach and made herself at home in a cottage only a stone's throw from Byron's villa, thunderstorms and torrential downpours were hot on her heels. They have had a bit of decent weather. Shelley writes that we spent our pleasant hours on the lake or wandering on its shores. But things soon took a turn for the worst. It proved a wet, ungenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house. And by all accounts, the storms were pretty dreadful. As Mary writes, one night we enjoyed a finer storm than I had ever before beheld. The lake was lit up, the pines on Jura made visible, and all the scene illuminated for an instant, when a pitchy blackness succeeded, and the thunder came in frightful bursts over our heads amid the darkness. So, bad weather forced Mary, Percy, Claire, Byron, and Byron's physician, John Polidori, to stay indoors, and, as such, they were forced to come up with ways to amuse themselves while they waited out the storm. And that's where Byron chimed in and suggested that they all take part in a ghost story writing competition. "We will each write a ghost story," said Lord Byron, and his proposition was acceded to. Who could write the most unnerving tale? The conditions were perfect. It was dark, spooky, stormy. They had bags of time on their hands. So they set to work. But while her companions wrote, Mary struggled. She couldn't come up with an idea. I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to this task. One which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror. One to make the reader dread to look around, to curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of the heart. If I did not accomplish these things, my ghost story would be unworthy of its name. I thought and pondered vainly. I felt that blank incapability of invention which is the greatest misery of authorship, when dull nothing replies to our anxious invocations. "Have you thought of a story?" I was asked each morning, and each morning I was forced to reply with a mortifying negative. It would seem Mary Shelley was suffering from the age-old problem of writer's block, which, if you're a writer yourself, you can take comfort in. Even the greats have their off days. While the bigwig poets in the parlour next door composed their tales, she couldn't get hers off the ground. But all that was about to change. One night, Mary had a dream. When I placed my head on my pillow, I did not sleep, nor could I be said to think. My imagination, unbidden, possessed and guided me, gifting the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man, stretched out and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir within an uneasy, half-vital motion. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery but speculative eyes. I opened mine in terror. The idea so possessed my mind that a thrill of fear ran through me, and I wished to exchange the ghastly image of my fancy for the realities around. I see them still. The very room, the dark parquet, the closed shutters with the moonlight struggling through, and the sense I had that the glassy lake and white high Alps were beyond. I could not so easily get rid of my hideous phantasm. Still, it haunted me. Swift as light and as cheering was the idea that broke in upon me. I have found it! What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the spectre which had haunted my midnight pillow. On the morrow I announced that I had thought of a story. I began that day with the words, "It was on a dreary night of November," making only a transcript of the grim terrors of my waking dream. It's important to point out here that this preface was a later addition to the novel. The original 1818 version of Frankenstein wasn't contextualised in such a Gothic manner. Shelley chooses to really lean into the Gothic here. Drawing on traditions of the female Gothic in particular, that's writers like Anne Radcliffe. Learn more about her staggeringly spooky literary influence by clicking here, next. And going all out to set the scene. As Angela Wright points out, Shelley's 1831 account of her nightmare was a powerful vision of Gothic narratology in itself, and one which coerced the reader into sharing the terror of Victor Frankenstein. A shrewd way to reframe her masterpiece and make it even more scintillating to her readers. So, There are many elements that had to coalesce in order for Mary to have such a thrilling dream, the one that originated the story of Frankenstein. Everything was dark and gloomy, even in the daytime. Great thunderstorms rolled overhead. The five of them had been reading spooky stories to each other, the perfect recipe for dark dreams. But, I hear you musing, that doesn't really explain the specifics, does it? Sharing ghost stories in a spooky setting is a bit vague. By that logic, surely she could have come up with anything, a werewolf poem or a headless horseman screenplay. What I want to know is what inspired this specific idea of bringing the dead back to life. What got Shelley ruminating on the gruesome assembly of human remains to form a creature of frightful proportions? What inspired her to write a character, Victor Frankenstein, who will stop at nothing to bend the laws of nature and play God? Well, in actual fact, these very ideas were fresh in Mary's mind. During their stint sequestered indoors at the mercy of the weather gods, the group discussed and debated the electrifying scientific concept of galvanism. On the 20th of September, 1786, scientist Luigi Galvani electrified a dead frog. Much to his surprise, delight, horror, maybe, I don't know, the frog's legs started to move. Now, the frog, unlike Frankenstein's creature, didn't then get up, walk out and start wreaking havoc. But that's not to say Galvani and his followers dismissed this possibility. Galvani believed he had discovered proof of animal electricity and went on experimenting to push the limits of this theory that electric charges could bring the dead back to life. It might seem completely fantastical to us today, but in the early 1800s this was an untapped possibility, and it became very much a la mode. Heated debates raged over the provenance and potential of galvanism, the theories and arguments of which both Mary and Percy Shelley were very familiar with. It was kind of hard not to be, especially when scientists started taking things to the next level and galvanising not just dead frogs, but dead people. As Ewan Morris writes, on January 17, 1803, a young man named George Forster was hanged for murder at Newgate Prison in London. After his execution, as often happened, his body was carried ceremoniously across the city to the Royal College of Surgeons, where it would be publicly dissected. What actually happened was rather more shocking than simple dissection, though. Forster was going to be electrified. The Times newspaper reported, on the first application of the process to the face, the jaw of the deceased criminal began to quiver. The adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion. It looked, to some spectators, as if the wretched man was on the eve of being restored to life. The man undertaking this grisly experiment was none other than Giovanni Aldini, nephew of Galvani, who sought to preserve and continue his uncle's legacy by experimenting on the severed heads of criminals, noting how, after jolting them with an electric current, their faces contracted in such a way as to produce the appearance of the most horrid grimaces. The action of the eyelids, he writes, was extremely striking. So, essentially, it wasn't uncommon for fresh corpses to be taken off for experimentation in this especially macabre manner, and people had lots of opinions about it. As Lita Judge writes, galvanism experiments were graphically recorded in the press, causing such public outcry that the practice was banned in 1805. Nevertheless, bringing the dead back to life was a hot topic, to which the five friends weathering the storm not far from the turbulent shores of Lake Geneva were not immune. In fact, as Shelley writes, on the very eve of her waking dream, she had been privy to a very long conversation between Percy and Byron about philosophical doctrines, including the nature of the principle of life. She describes their conversation. Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things. Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together and endued with vital warmth. Night waned upon this talk, and even the witching hour had gone by before we retired to rest. Mary went to sleep that night on the back of this intense philosophical discussion over life, death, and reanimation. She was embroiled in ideas of bringing the dead back to life and the actual potential that this could happen. And I think this is important to recognise. To Mary, Frankenstein was born out of actual, real-world possibility. It wasn't far-fetched or fanciful to her or to her readers. As Morris writes, Frankenstein might look like fantasy to modernise, but to its author and original readers there was nothing fantastic about it. Just as everyone knows about artificial intelligence now, so Shelley's readers knew about the possibilities of electrical life. And just as AI invokes a range of responses and arguments now, so did the prospect of electrical life, and Shelley's novel, then. Bringing the dead back to life was an issue at the forefront of scientific debate, and we see this issue played out in her novel. This is cutting-edge stuff, and it's the deliberation, the nuance, and the care with which she, as a very young woman, handles these kinds of expansive philosophical themes that speaks to her skill, her brilliance, and her talent. So, I began by listing all the reasons Mary Shelley led an unconventional life, and I've attempted to show how these factors played into the creation of Frankenstein. But in other ways, Shelley's life was conventional, in that she went through something at a very young age that a shocking number of people went through in the early 1800s, and which can also be read as essential to the formation of Frankenstein: child loss. On the 6th of March 1815, Mary Shelley wrote to her friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg, "My dearest Hogg, my baby is dead. Will you come to me as soon as you can? I wish to see you. It was perfectly well when I went to bed. I awoke in the night to give it suck. It appeared to be sleeping so quietly that I would not wake it. It was dead then, but we did not find out that until the morning. From its appearance, it evidently died of convulsions. I am no longer a mother now. Mary." Mary wrote this letter about the loss of her first baby when she was just a teenager. Her journal entries over the following days and weeks are filled with references to the loss. On the 9th, she writes, "Still thinking about my little baby. It is hard indeed for a mother to lose a child." And on the 13th, "Stay at home and think of my little dead baby. This is foolish, I suppose. Yet whenever I am left alone to my own thoughts and do not read to divert them, they always come back to the same point. That I was a mother, and am so no longer." These diary entries are very difficult to read, and I don't know about you, there's also something in them that I wouldn't necessarily have expected that surprises me a little. This idea that she's still thinking about her baby. The word "still" implying that she shouldn't be, that she should have moved on by now maybe, and bear in mind she's writing this just 3 days after the event. Why does Shelley phrase it that way? I think to our modern sensibilities, losing a child, one of the worst things that can happen to a person, isn't something anyone would expect a parent to stop thinking about after 3 days. I mean, I've never experienced that kind of loss, but I can't imagine it's something you ever get past or get over. So this idea that she's still thinking about her baby as though she shouldn't be is a really alien sentiment to my mind, as is the idea that now she's lost her baby, she's no longer a mother. Again, I have no experience of this. Maybe for some people this is how they feel, and fair enough. But I would imagine that people who lose children probably often still feel like mothers, fathers, parents. There's something about Shelley's disengagement from parenthood that makes this even more sorrowful and sad, as though that part of her identity, her life, has been erased. I'm not sure how much Shelley's thinking has to do with her personal outlook, her coping mechanisms, and the context in which she wrote. But I want to acknowledge that perhaps her will to stop thinking about her baby and her literal approach to motherhood, in which she stops being a mother now her baby is no longer alive, may well have something to do with the fact that child loss in this period was harrowingly common. In Britain, in the early 19th century, almost a third of all children died before their 5th birthday. Life expectancy was bad across the board, but especially so for poor people living in industrial towns. A person born into a labouring family in Liverpool, for example, would be lucky to see their 16th birthday. So maybe Shelley's attitude towards her own grief is partly born out of proximity to death. Losing a child was a common occurrence, so she doesn't want to make a big deal of it, to put it bluntly. But as Shelley finds out, just because something is the norm doesn't necessarily make it any less painful. 6 days later, on the 19th of March, she writes, "Dreamed that my little baby came to life again. That it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it by the fire and it lived. I awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day." A year and a half after the loss of her first child, Shelley would write a novel about bringing the dead back to life. Many scholars have drawn parallels between Victor's obsession with creating life from death and Shelley's dream, her longing to breathe life into the child she lost. To claim this as a definite causal link would be speculative, but it is important context, and it shouldn't be ignored. Shelley was very well read. She engaged in popular debate about science, radicalism, and galvanism. She spent time with people who encouraged her literary talents. These factors, as well as the specific spooky circumstances of the Villa Diodati during the year without a summer, seem to have contributed to the birth of Frankenstein. But so too did Shelley's own personal circumstances and her own experiences of death, birth, and motherhood. Motherhood, or the lack thereof, is everywhere in the novel. Victor loses his mother, gives life to a motherless creature, and ultimately loses his life because he defies nature, the ultimate mother, whose vast and uncompromising landscapes shape and dominate the novel. Maybe Shelley's own grappling with motherhood, with this sense that with child loss comes the loss of being a mother, is reflected in the novel's complex and merciless exploration of the limits and anguishes of giving life. So, what is the story behind the story? It's far too easy to say that Mary Shelley had a dream one night and one of literature's greatest novels sprung forth from her pen fully formed. As Judge writes, it's a bit of a popular myth that Frankenstein was conceived spontaneously on a stormy night in answer to a dare to write a ghost story. That evening did occur, but countless events in Mary's life before and after that evening played a much greater role in the horror novel's creation. If we ignore these events, and more importantly, if we ignore Shelley's innate and unmatched skill as a writer, if we reduce the conception of Frankenstein down to a bit of a fluke, a dream that could have happened to anyone, we do her an extraordinary disservice. Rather, what I hope this video has shown is that Shelley took her intellectualism, her book learning, her intelligence, her life experiences, and her knowledge of science, the Gothic, and the world around her to create a novel that has been our constant companion over the last 200 years, and, I hope, will remain by our sides for centuries to come. Enjoyed learning more about how Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein? Learn more about what the novel can teach us about sexism, racism, and prejudice in general by clicking here next. She's fast asleep.